I'm still upset that y'all took Jessica's spell from us.
I know, I wish I could say I'm sorry about that. She's awesome. She's pretty cool. Testing, can you hear this?
Yes,
All right,
we
perfect.
can hear you.
Yes.
Hey there, how are you?
How are you, Bobby? Thank you for being here.
If you all, you all just go ahead and say a few words.
Hello, Mary, how are you? Good, how are you? No. BGT here, you know, grand. There's some like good ones, you know.
What do you go by?
Grand Mary. Do you? Yeah. I love it. Grand Mary. Grand. Not Grand Mary. Grand. Oh, that is what. Yeah, Grand Mary. In February.
How exciting.
I am. So excited. It's fun.
No, for home.
Oh, that's so cute.
I did it last night. Till next week. Do some.
I think so.
She and she did it before, so actually she's so good. Then nothing. Chinese. Dinner. We did a barbecue, so we brought the bourbon and she did.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank you all for being here today. We'll go ahead and get started maybe with introductions first. One of our panelists is running a little late, so he'll be joining us shortly. Maybe we can start with Adam and go down the table if you can provide your name and your institutional affiliation.
Sure. My name is Adam Blevins. I'm the Associate Director of Finance Policy Programs at the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education.
I'm Todd Gilbert. I serve as the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at the Kentucky Community Technical College System.
Hi, I'm Angie Martin, and I'm the Chief Budget Officer at the University of Kentucky.
And I'm Mary Sister Tucker. I'm Vice President CFO at Morgan State University.
Right, Adam, go ahead.
Oh, we're jumping right in.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so today what I'm going to be sharing with you all is hopefully going to be a pretty high level overview of some of the things generally CPD does with regard to finance and budgeting at the secondary institutions. But really primarily what finance policy programs does in this capacity. I'm gonna get my slides to you.
Oh.
There we go. All right. So this should be a hopefully a pretty straightforward discussion today as far as my section with speaking time. Like I said, I'm going to give a very broad overview of CPD, Council on Post-Secondary Education, as well as a handful of the things that my unit does for finance policy programs. So that will include a very high level overview of the post-secondary budget request process, tuition setting process, performance funding model, and just a handful of other statutory duties that we do pretty quickly. Now, what I will say is this is not intended to be a deep dive. I could take any one of these topics and probably spend the whole 2 hours running through what it was like in the end. Most of the folks on this panel will probably attest to, since they all kind of interface with this stuff as well. But we'll jump right in to the introduction to the Council on Post-Secondary Aid. So we are a statewide coordinating board for Kentucky's public post-secondary system. And really a lot of what we do is collaborate with our institutions, institutional leadership, legislature, really primarily to improve post-secondary education, but that is driven through sound policy that is really aimed at assisting our students, families, and of course, ensuring that our institutions have the resources they need to continue serving the Commonwealth. Some of the specific things that my unit does, like I said, it's biennial budget development, tuition fee setting, performance funding. We'll go into all of that in a bit of depth. But essentially, the council is here on the policy side of the post-secondary education system, as well as doing some of the compliance functions, as you say, coordinating. So we're going to open up and run through the overview of the post-secondary budget request process. This is done, our budget is a biennial budget, so this is done every 2 years. This is on an odd number year where we start planning for the upcoming 2 biennial. So actually this year we have gone through this process. Everything has to be submitted to governor's office as well as the General Assembly by October 1 each odd number year. But this process really is quite a collaborative one. It starts early in the year, typically early spring, somewhere around there. And it's a very collaborative discussion, negotiation with our institutions to essentially analyze what the institution needs are at the ground level and consolidate that up into a full statewide post-secondary budget request, which is much easier said than done, especially building consensus around what every institution is saying. So for the components of this budget request, there are really 4 primary ones that we work with and that we submit. I'll really only focus on the top 2 there. So operating funds, so funds that institutions use to operate on a day-to-day basis, capital investment that goes into facilities. You can think of things like renovation and renewal of existing facilities, or new construction projects. You can also get into things like equipment, and IT needs, things like that are also included in that capital investment request. Trust funds, we don't always include, in terms of budget requests. We do have one this year. So I believe about $30 million, for fiscal years to request. And that's really to, reimburse institutions for some of the money that they, use on the mandated, statutorily mandated, tuition rate programs, for the state. Final piece is.
Excuse me?
It's the agency operations for the council, so that is kind of outside of scope. of this, so that's
Excuse
why-
me.
Hold on just a second.
Sorry, we're trying to get a hold of
Is
you
everybody
guys on the
having trouble
chat.
hearing?
Yes.
Give me a thumbs up, maybe, because I'm looking at it. Okay, all right. Give us a minute or two and we'll work on that, all right? Hold on just a second.
Hey Sheila, I think in the comments, I think we have two computers going, yours and theirs was going. I don't know if it'd be any better if it was just theirs.
Sheila, just instead of having to type this in the chat, I think what it was is that you all were in the same room and your computer's mic was on. So it was picking up your mic on your computer and then their mics on the table. So if we just have the conference table going and have your computer muted, it should work out the issue. My inner IT help desk is coming back out in me again. Sorry.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect.
Yes. Yep, I can
Yes.
hear you much better.
Excellent. All right. Well, we are going to run with this then. Let's see. Perfect. Sheila, can I go ahead and do I have control over this? Can I just share screen with mine or my device? Perfect. All right. Excellent. So if everyone can see that, we can pick up then. All right. So I believe where I left off, I was just saying we don't really get into the agency operations in this particular presentation. So, um, that's not something I'm going to focus on for this presentation. So I just want to give you all kind of a flavor of what this post-secondary budget request looks like. Like I said, it's a very collaborative process that involves a lot of work between my office, my unit, and our institution's chief budget officers, our CP president, institution presidents, with plenty of feedback from legislators as well. So this is a very involved process to develop, like I said, a system-wide, a statewide post-secondary education budget request. Now, one of the big pieces of that budget request is for the operating funds. And what you see here is what has been requested for the 2026 to 2028 operating request. I will say there is quite a bit of minutia you could get into in terms of contingency plans and things like that, if one thing is authorized versus not authorized. But really, this is just to give you a snapshot of what exactly, is part of this operating request. One of the big pieces there, as you can see under the additional budget request section, we're asking on top of the base rate that you see at the top row there for an inflation adjustment. That's 4.5% in the first fiscal year, 9% compared to the base for the second. And then for performance funding, $30 million in fiscal one and about $45 million in fiscal two, added to what is already in the performance fund. Right now, that'd be about $160 million at the end of that second biennium. And for the capital side of this is kind of the other big part of that budget request. It's really divided into two pieces. So the first of which I think I touched on earlier, asset preservation. We have a pretty big need, I'd say, across all of our institutions for asset preservation funds. That's money that goes for the renovation, renewal, and upgrade of existing facilities and infrastructure on our campuses. Campuses, as I'm sure you're aware, have an aging infrastructure. Every year they get older, more things break, other things start to approach the end of their life, like HVAC systems, so on and so forth. And so there's a significant need for asset preservation funds. And in fact, the last estimate that we had from 2013, we did a big comprehensive study. We call it the VFA study, but they had predicted that by 2021, or estimated that by 2021, there'd be about $7.3 billion of asset preservation need across the state for, again, facility renewal, renovation, and infrastructure and upgrades. Now, what the asset preservation pool request is for the biennium, it's $700 million. That would be allocated across institutions according to the share of what we call Category 1 and Category 2 square footage. That's essentially education and general spaces, offices, administrative facilities, so on and so forth. But that's $700 million for the biennium. With debt service listed there, that's if this is bond funded, this is essentially how much would have to be paid back on those bonds in that second row there. For new construction, this is a distinct part of this. This year is a little unusual. Every biennium, we typically request some form of asset preservation pool. For the last two biennia, we've actually requested this exact amount at $700 million for an asset preservation pool. But for new construction projects, we're asking for about $1.76 billion for new construction projects across all of our campuses. Now, what is included in that is each university's highest priority new capital construction project. A lot of those are for like classroom buildings related to STEMH, facilities that would need, larger space for like learning labs and more hands-on learning, technical spaces for KCTCS. And for KCTCS, it is their top 10 highest priority new capital construction projects, given the breadth of those campuses across the state and the relatively low cost compared to some of the facilities for universities on a per project basis. So like I said, keeping it high level, that's to give you somewhat of a flavor for what the budget request looks like this year, what that process generally looks like. But now we're going to kind of pivot and do the same thing for tuition and fee, the tuition and fee setting process. Now, what I'll say at the top of this slide is I don't explicitly write it here on the slide, but when I start talking about tuition and mandatory fee ceilings, those really only apply for resident undergraduate students. We do allow institutions to charge market competitive rates for like graduate programs, online programs, and there is a stipulation for non-resident students. I'll get to in just a moment whenever we get down to the tuition and mandatory fee policy bullet there. But essentially what the tuition and fee setting process looks like, it starts with my unit here at CP, Finance Policy and Programs, conducting what is functionally a very substantial environmental scan, kind of getting some information and contextualizing things like inflationary trends compared to state appropriation levels over time, enrollment retention trends, pretty much anything you can think of from like an institution level comparison to an interstate comparison, to really understand what the financial trends are looking like, because tuition and fees, as well as state support through appropriation, those are two of the biggest parts of institutional budgets. And so this really helps guide our ability to set these tuition and fee ceilings that are essentially designed to balance institutional resource needs with the affordability of post-secondary education for students and families, which, like everything we do, is a lot easier said than done. So we work, once we have this environmental scan in hand and some of this data collected, we work with our institutions, their CBOs, institution presidents, to get a general consensus around what seems to be a good balance in terms of how much does tuition and fee rates need to go up to kind of compensate for some of that inflationary pressure that everyone experiences on a year-to-year basis. And this all culminates essentially in April. I should say this is not done annually. Typically it can be. We typically do this every 2 years, and we just recently did this in 2025. But we approve those tuition fee ceilings somewhere around April, so the spring, and then institutions submit to us their tuition and fee rates, their proposed tuition and fee rates, that we vet, make sure they're in compliance with the tuition mandatory fee policy that the council has in place. And then if they are aligned with those tuition and fee ceilings, then they are approved for the upcoming academic year. And we do those reviews every year for the proposed tuition and fee rates by institution. And here's this, just to give you some sense of what these increases have looked like year to year. You can see that green line kind of denotes where we began implementing some form of tuition and fee ceiling. You can see some pretty significant increases to that tuition mandatory fee rate prior to 2009, 2010, where we started implementing some of these ceilings to deal with affordability and accessibility for students and families. And you can now see that it stays pretty close to that 2 to 3% range in terms of the actual growth year to year. Okay, so this is, again, just a snapshot of what this looks like for the current academic year and the upcoming academic year in terms of these tuition and fee ceilings. We have approved through the council a maximum base rate increase of no more than $675 over 2 years, $450 in any single year for our public research institutions. For our comprehensives, that's $630 over 2 years, no more than $420 in any given year for the tuition fee increase. And KCTCS is charged hourly, so that's $9 per credit hour over 2 years is the cap, and no more than $6 per credit hour increase in any 1 year. Okay. Now, on to the performance funding model. Again, just a very quick high-level overview of this. The model was essentially established under Senate Bill 153 back in the 2017 regular session. This predates my time with the council, but it was a collaborative effort, like just about everything we do across our campus presidents, the CPE president, representative of the governor, and some legislative leadership as well. And what I will say is that part of this legislation requires a performance fund working group, which is essentially composed of the same folks that are listed in that top bullet there. It includes all of our institution presidents, the CPE president, as well as folks from the legislature and an appointee from the governor. But the goal of this model is essentially to align state funding with college completion, student success metrics, really intended to incentivize institutions to enroll, progress, and graduate more students through this funding mechanism. Like I mentioned before, there's a performance funding working group. They are statutorily required to meet every 3 years to review, provide recommendations for revision, make sure that the model is functioning as intended. But that group does tend to meet more often than every 3 years. The most recent occurrence of that group coming together was after the 2024 regular session. There was a call for the working group to convene after the underrepresented minority premium in the model was stricken from the legislation, and the General Assembly requested that that group meet for the sole purpose of defining an underrepresented student, which would take the place of that original underrepresented minority student metric. At the end of that, at the beginning of this year, I should say, what was finally landed on was first generation students as the supplement to that underrepresented student metric that was previously included. Or underrepresented minority metric, I should say. It is still called an underrepresented student metric within the model. In terms of the model components, when we talk about the performance funding model, we're essentially really talking about two models. We have one for the universities and one for KCTCS. And this is really to differentiate some of the mission between those two systems. Because if you think about it, for example, KCTCS, one of the metrics included in that model is for transfer to a four-year institution. Someone that is already at a four-year institution doesn't necessarily, that doesn't really apply. But it is a very important part of KCTCS's work, to support students as they graduate from those institutions and move on to get higher degrees and credentials as needed. So both of the models, though, they do have very similar structure. They both have a requirement for student success outcomes, which think of things like graduation, generation of degrees, certificates. That's about 40% of the university model, 35% for KCTCS. Course completion, so essentially completing credit hours on a year-to-year basis, 30% for universities, 35% for KCTCS. And then operational support is intended to assist with really M&O costs, so maintenance and operating costs for a lot of facilities. And that metric is predicated on a share of square footage dedicated to educating students at each institution. We run the model here at CPE for the universities. KCTCS runs it for their system. And at the end of this, both of those must be certified and presented to the Office of State Budget Director, to Secretary John Hicks by May 1st each year. Here is a very quick look at what that distribution looks like for the most recent run of that model. So for the 25-26 run, you can see there in column E, it is highlighted in blue what each institution got out of this model. according to their performance in the performance funding model. I will say I've had this question before. How does KCTCS kind of get this allocation? It's essentially mirroring the proportion of state appropriation that the system gets through the general fund appropriation. So it's about 21, 22%, somewhere around that, of the available monies in that performance fund. Now, a quick snapshot of some of the other duties that we have. One of the big ones that my unit works on is the administration of pass-through funds, trust funds. One of those big ones is the endowment match program. That program allows institutions to seek private donations to match on a dollar-for-dollar basis with state funds to establish endowments related to things like scholarships, professorships, all of which must be focused on STEM H as the current pot requires. We also have an equine trust fund program, and that is essentially something of an asset preservation pool, but specifically for equine equine programs across the Commonwealth. We do a lot of work with capital here as well, primarily the review and approval, certification of things like interim capital projects, capital budgets. We went through that a bit on the first section of this presentation, but if there's a project that is not approved in the biennial budget and it comes up kind of between those sessions, CPE and the council has to review those projects before they can be sent for authorization from the legislature. We also administer that, or we certify for that asset preservation pool to ensure that projects requesting funding from that pool meets the stipulations required by the statute and the CPE guidelines for the asset preservation pool. We also do a lot of research and legislative review, particularly whenever we are in session as a state. That starts in January, it'll run to April or May. And we also are trying to expand quite a bit in terms of what we do for financial monitoring. We do a lot of like CFI calculations, looking at the financial stability and viability of our institutions. And some of that you may be aware of comes up or came up in the 2025 regular session with Senate Bill 77. So I'll touch a little bit on that because it is probably a point of interest for many of you on this call. But Senate Bill 77 was passed in this last legislative session, and it requires that four-year comprehensive institutions, among some other thresholds, maintain sufficient unrestricted cash reserves in short-term investments to cover the institution's total operating and non-operating expenses for 3 months as calculated from the prior fiscal year's audited financial statements. And this requirement is in place for comprehensive institutions to request a new doctoral program. So there are some other student success metrics that are included that are essentially monitored and run by our data and analytics team here at CPE. But we run this liquidity metric, and this is kind of our first year running through it. So the process is still kind of getting ironed out. But we do run the liquidity model or the liquidity calculation through our unit in order to assess the financial viability of these programs. I shouldn't say viability of the program, but really the financial position of an institution to take on some of the potential costs of doctoral programs, which can be quite costly, particularly upfront. We've operationalized this calculation through a pretty straightforward method here. You can see it's essentially that equation at the bottom. We look at the unrestricted cash reserves plus any short-term investments. So it's essentially any money an institution can access within a month. And we divide that by their total operating and non-operating expenses. So all of the obligations that an institution has. And that gives us essentially a way of calculating the liquidity. How long can an institution, if all other funding is kind of cut off, how long could that institution continue to pay on those obligations? This is a really quick example of that, but it's about 4.3 months in this example. This is not any institution in particular. This is just kind of a sample to show you. But that's really all I have. Like I said, I know this is a very high-level overview, and I am happy to go more in depth with you all with questions, online or offline. feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss more about any of the things that we went through today. I'm sure Sheila will provide you with my email address, so do not hesitate to get in touch if you would like anything to discuss anything. But I thank you all for your time.
Does anyone have any questions? Sorry, we're working on the echo. Questions for Adam? All right, give us another 2 minutes and we're gonna see about fixing the sound. Sorry about that. Adam, you can come back into that conference room if you don't mind.
Okay, perfect.
Sheila, just to give you an idea, when you unmuted that second time, you sounded better. So I think you're doing okay.
Hello. Is it working?
Can the people online hear us like this?
Yep, we're good.
Awesome.
I needed to look.
Testing, can you hear me?
Does it sound?
They're hearing us, yes.
They are hearing us.
Yes, I got a lot of things out.
Can everyone online see and hear us now? Does it sound okay still?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, all right, great. Well, thank you all for bearing with us through the slight technical hiccups that we've had. Hopefully you'll see a lot of how a university specific budget is developed through this presentation and how it kind of links to the work that CPE does for us that Adam just discussed. So today we're going to talk about really what's the purpose of a university budget and to understand kind of the key phases of a budget process for most universities and talk about what the typical sources of funds are and how those funds are typically used at most universities. From there, we'll move into a discussion of the common budget models that are currently being used and out there, and the impact of curriculum mapping, and discuss a little bit about new program evaluation. So we'll just jump right in. Maybe.
Many of y'all
Maybe
Zoom
we
meeting.
won't. So, why does a university need a budget? Well, basically, a budget is the way that a university puts its money where its mouth is, to point an old saying. So, basically, it translates the strategic goals that a university has into actionable plans by funding the top priorities and initiatives that the university has. And it's also a way to ensure stability and for the university financially and planning for the future. So each campus that you all are on probably has slightly variations of how they approach the budget process, but all of them should include these key elements. And the first three boxes up there really probably could have been a circle because, early in the process, we all begin with reviewing what are strategic priorities and forecasting at a very detailed level, what does enrollment look like based on historical retention trends, and what does expenses look like based on strategic needs for those strategic priorities to be met, as well as inflationary pressures.
And then through various avenues of campus discussion, some campuses will use committees, some campuses use more kind of a top-down, bottom-up process. The resources of the university will get allocated to those strategic important initiatives. Through that process, there's constant feedback from stakeholders as that budget is developed. And typically they'll go through many iterations before a final budget is presented to the governing body for final approval. And then those plans or budgets are implemented and monitored for the remainder of the financial process. So I can tell you that at most universities, we've already kicked off, some of us over a month or two ago, the process of developing the budget for next fiscal year. So it's really almost a continuous process. It's not something that we just pick up a month or two before, June 30th to develop. It's a long process to develop. And one of the key reasons why I think it's important for faculty members to understand this process is the more that faculty can understand what the sources and constraints are that are on their university campus, they can help to align the departmental request with the institutional priorities. And that enables greater participation in that resource planning, if you will, process of the university budget development. So all of our campuses use various approaches to the budget, and some of us use mixes of these. These are kind of the things that you see most often. The first approach is just incremental budgeting, and that typically is where the university will look at what the current year budget is, and then only look at what things need to change and adjust to build the next year budget. Zero-based budgeting is a second approach that is used. It is basically where you start from scratch every single year, and so you would justify every dollar of expense that is needed each year to develop the budget for the next year. There's also a performance-based budget model, which is where funding gets tied to measurable outcomes. And then lastly, there's something that's termed RCM, which is responsibility centered management. And that's where colleges or the units actually kind of work as their own revenue or their own, business, if you will. So if y'all had the opportunity to read the article that Sheila shared with everyone on Oregon State, it discusses kind of the unintended consequences that can happen when you move from one budget approach to another budget approach, and how important it is to have folks on campus really understand how the budget process works. So I encourage you guys to, if you haven't already, reach out to just your budget office staff and just kind of gain a better understanding of what budget model your institution uses and how that impacts the way that resources are allocated to your academic units. So when you look at a university's financial statements, if you take a step back, we've been talking about budget, but when you look at the whole university's income statement, or for public universities, it's called the Statement of Revenues, Expenses, and Changes in Net Position. There's really two primary categories. There's current funds and non-current funds that make up the statement. And so the things in green are what's considered the non-current funds. Those are things like endowment funds, which I assume most of you all know what an endowment is, but that's where there's a principal amount that is set aside that cannot be spent, but the earnings off of it can be utilized to do things like support scholarships or endowed chairs, things like that. So most of our universities would also have loan funds. Perkins Loan Fund is probably the most common loan fund that universities would have. Those are funds that are set aside to give to loans to the students and students repay. And that's another category that's considered a non-current fund. And then plant funds is really those facility funds, equipment, buildings, those kinds of expenses and assets that have an impact on a university's financial statements. The bottom section, agency funds, some of us will have funds that are deposited at the university that really are not the university's money. I think about like some student organizations and things like that. So the agency funds is just a very small component of the overall statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net assets, and likely has no net impact at the end of the year. But I did want to put it on there because some folks do have it. So in the orange, we have current funds, which is really what funds are expended to take care of, as it says, current operations of the university. And those really are split into two categories. There's restricted funds, and what is meant by restricted is that somebody external to the university has restrictions on how the money can be spent. So these are things like the Pell Grant money that we all receive from the federal government. It might be for those of us that charge an asset preservation fee. You know, those are restricted funds that can only be used for asset preservation expenses, things of that nature. And then the darker orange is the unrestricted funds, which are those general operating funds that can be used for any purpose that the university sees as a strategic initiative. Most universities budget the unrestricted, well, everybody budgets your current unrestricted funds. Some will also budget restricted, and universities that have an all funds budget approach would budget their endowment returns and use of endowment earnings and money, interest income and things like that. So universities are different in how far their budget, how many of these squares their budget covers, but all of us would have the dark orange column as part of their budget. And when a university goes to budget, to develop its budget, they have various sources of revenue. The things that I've put highlighted there in yellow are the unrestricted, would be considered the current unrestricted revenues. And, you know, the main drivers for most of for all of the regional comprehensives would be student fees, state appropriations, indirect cost recoveries, which is money that is earned off of federal and state grants and contracts to cover administrative costs and facility costs for the staff and the resources that are used to carry out the missions of the grants and contracts. Universities will also have some interest on their cash investments, their operating cash reserves, and then they'll typically have some goods and services sales. And these are kind of the big ticket items. Research institutions or would potentially have the larger, indirect cost recoveries, and institutions like UK that has a hospital-based, a hospital as part of the university would naturally have the healthcare, revenues as a main driver as well. Some universities, as I said, may also budget the restricted funds. Those could be things from gifts for gifts to the university, the income off of those gifts, if you will, or distributions from endowments, the state appropriations for specific purposes, grants and contracts from external entities that, have strings attached, if you will, of how the money can be spent, and just other types of grants and contracts. And then lastly, some institutions will budget non-current funds, which would be like the investment income off of the endowments and loan funds and other when you look at expenses for a university, all of our public institutions follow GASB, and as part of the GASB, financial statements are represented in what's called functional classifications. And so for most of us, the instructional cost would be the largest, naturally, of the functional classifications. And then from there, typically it would be student services, financial aid, those kinds of things. And a lot of that will depend on how the university is structured, whether they have a separate foundation that funds the scholarships for student aid, and who makes the decision on who's getting the scholarship. That will play into whether the expenses on the university's financial statements or not. But when you look at a university's expenses based on like their natural classification, naturally the number one expense is personnel, which is compensation and benefits for our faculty and our staff. And these percentages that I'm showing here on the screen actually are real for Morehead State a couple of years ago. I did not update it for this year's presentation, but so this is a real kind of view of how the budget is allocated. So supplies and operating service contracts, things like that, you see pales in comparison to the personnel and benefit costs of the university. So that is one of the reasons why when we talk about curriculum mapping, curriculum mapping is really important for making sure that we achieve the desired outcomes, learning outcomes for the programs, and to align the strategic goals of the university with curriculum that's being taught. The curriculum mapping also has a huge impact on the financial stability of a university because of the significant portion of the university's budget that goes towards faculty costs and instructional costs. So one of the key benefits to curriculum mapping is being able to identify when there's redundancies or overlaps in courses to allow for a more efficient use of faculty time. So when just hypothetically, if we're building the fall of 26 schedule, a university can really benefit by looking at having a detailed course mapping, curriculum mapping of, in this example, what it takes to get an accounting degree versus a finance degree. And in this example, you can see that both of those degree programs require Tax 201. However, the finance typically recommend that students take it in the spring semester, whereas accounting is typically recommending for it to be taught in the fall semester. And likewise, econ is, in this, both of them having the spring semester. So, if you think about using faculty staff time efficiently, this might be an opportunity, that the tax 201 might be an opportunity to look at when the courses really need to be taken, and is there an opportunity to have both of these degree programs require tax in the fall semester, or both required in the spring semester, so that you can maximize the enrollment levels and the credit hour generation by the faculty that teach that. Likewise, on the econ 101, where you've got, here 2 programs, but let's say hypothetically, if we had 7 programs that were requiring econ 30 or 201, 101, I can't talk today, as part of their degree program, having the detailed mapping for all 7 of those programs would enable the chair of the econ department to hypothetically run reports, find out what the course volume need is for a given spring semester, to ensure that we don't have bottlenecks or delayed time to degree because students can't get in the course. And that may provide for an opportunity to actually move to maybe offering econ in the fall and in the spring, depending on the number of econ faculty. So a well-structured curriculum program really will help with student progression, because as we talked about with that econ 101, it can eliminate bottlenecks and ensure that courses are being available. And it also helps to determine the faculty FTE that are required to make sure that students can progress to degree in a timely manner, which ultimately will increase universities' retention and graduation rates, hopefully, and increased retention and graduation rates leads to increased tuition revenue and stability over time for the university. It can also help to identify potentially high demand disciplines, and which could lead to the development of new programs to enhance new enrollment and tuition revenues. So when you start to look at an academic program financial review, typically the first step is to look at what kind of tuition revenue is there, and to determine that the potential net tuition revenue, really have to look at what the student demand is. And you can get at student demand by looking at other programs to see what their volume is, how many students they have graduating in each one of the degree programs that you're possibly looking at bringing on to your university. You can also look at labor trends. There's a lot of information out there from both at the federal and the state level on the employment trends, various degree programs or jobs that we required the degree program. And we talked already about the looking at the competition to see what their enrollment levels are, but also reviewing the competition can give you some indication of what kind of scholarships you might need to be able to offer to be competitive to start your program and get those students enrolled. So once you know, does it appear that there is opportunity for new net tuition, which is tuition less than the university aid? Then you've got to move on to look at what the cost is. And at Morehead State, when we look at this process, we really look at just the direct incremental cost of a program. And the first thing that you would always want to evaluate is what are the accreditation requirements to see whether there's added costs to be able to get accreditation for the program at the end. You need to look at what are the resources required. Is there unique laboratory equipment or laboratory space that's going to be required to start offering the program that you're reviewing? And then lastly, the staffing required. I don't know, how many times I've heard, well, we can do this additional business degree because we've already got business faculty. Well, that may very well be the case, but it may not be the case. If you've got a degree program that's going to require, looking back, to say tax 101, and you've only got one tax professor and his courses are already maxed, then there would be incremental costs because you need to bring on another adjunct faculty or potentially full-time faculty to teach tax if you were going to start, say, a master's in taxation program or what have you. So you really got to look at what kind of existing capacity you have in the courses, and this kind of goes back to developing that curriculum map for the degree program that you're looking at, and where would you have gaps, and that is how you would arrive at what the potential direct cost would be for the program. So I'll pause there and open it up. We've got the experts that at the table from research and community colleges as well as Adam. So we'll open it up and see what kind of questions that you guys have.
You're welcome to tell you what, go ahead and put your questions in the chat as you come up with them, but I've got a few to get started. Your faculty coaches sent forward some suggestions or some ideas that you all offered. So we'll go ahead and get started with those. Before we do that though, I wanted to let you all know one of our panelists is joining us online. Chris Calvert from NKU is online. So when I see him, I'll ask him to introduce himself, but I don't want to put him on the spot just yet. So
I'm here.
Hey, Chris, do you mind introducing yourself to the group?
Yeah, Chris Calvert, Chief Financial Officer and Vice President of Administration in Northern Kentucky University.
All right. So let's get started with a question about forecasting. So I had some questions. So there's a bunch of sub questions here, but the overall question is, what does the forecasting process look like? What resources or departments, internal or external, do institutions rely on to provide that information? Is there a shared methodology among institutions regarding forecasting? How do you model economic factors and things like student attrition into revenue forecasts? And how is revenue forecasted in general? So maybe Chris, if you don't mind, you can start talking a little bit from Northern, and then we'll have some of our other folks jump in.
Yeah, our forecasting process, kind of like Mary was talking about, it's really a continuous process. So we start with, the most important things that we're forecasting is going to be our revenue and really related to our net tuition revenue and enrollment. So we work very closely with our admissions and enrollment departments and our institutional research departments. They have their models and forecasts that they use. My financial planning and analytics department, and which is basically the same as my budget office. And then myself, we have our own forecasting that we do relative to enrollment and tuition. And then we use that. We combine those together. We review them at our cabinet level. I review them one-on-one with the president, and we're always updating those. You know, for example, we update them. The major updates are going to be with each semester, and but we look at, for example, we look really hard at fall. We know that spring semester is usually a derivative of the fall semester, and then summer is usually a derivative of fall and spring. So we look at those trends on single year, multi-year bases. We break it down by student type. So undergraduate, graduate, law school. We then break it down, further as we look at specific programs, particularly our larger programs, and see how those programs are performing. And we build those models. We work with our board, mostly with our board finance committee, to get buy-in on those. And then we use those to bake into our budget process. And like I said, and like Mary said, it's a very continuous process. We're always forecasting out 5 years. So as I start the upcoming budget cycle for fiscal year 27, I've already got assumptions built in from fiscal year 26. So I'm updating those as I get new information. So I update the fiscal year 27 through 31 forecast based off of fall enrollment. Once I've got fall enrollment, I'm looking at what our discounts and scholarships are, what any changes to tuition, discounts and scholarships are. We have a revenue sharing model for some of our students with an online marketing group. So I'm looking at those. So we're baking all that in. And then we're also looking at other forms of revenue, such as, and how those relate to tuition fees or don't. So we're looking at our housing and food service, which have basically are a derivative of our student enrollment, and then looking at other sources of revenue, whether that's random revenue, investments, et cetera.
Thank you. Maybe Angie, can you tell us a little bit about what that's like at UK? Sure. At UK, we do a lot similar to what Chris went through. We also have in the fall, we have enrollment meetings with each of the colleges to work on the next fall's enrollment projections, and that really helps shape both what we think our incoming first year class will be, as well as returning students, because different programs accept students at different points in time during their education career. But tuition revenue definitely has the most forecasting part of, I would say, on a routine basis. State appropriations, we're always watching what's going on with the state. We look at the monthly tax receipt reports just to see, are they on budget or not? And of course, we watch at the state level the consensus forecasting group to see what they're predicting for the current as well as the upcoming biennium. Todd, maybe you can tell us how it works at KCTCS.
Sure. It's really interesting when I saw this question. I'm old school. I have a notepad on my desk of big priorities to work on, and number one at the top was forecasting, because I think we do a good job of it at KCTCS. I think we could be a little more sophisticated around what we're doing. We do, because we have 16 colleges that are all independently accredited. It involves actually basically 16 different processes that we try to coordinate, but we haven't really set a lot of the guidelines around how that's done. So for those of you in a KCTCS institution, your college may do it differently in one place than the other, although it is basically the same. Take a look at what we're projecting around revenue. You take a look at what we're doing when it comes to the state appropriations. But we also do a couple of other things, including we have a number of workforce development projects we're working on. We have this program called Train, who are working with local industry to partner with our colleges. And that's done differently at each of the colleges. There's a different level of that. So we work very independently. Our job right now is coordinating some of that. I think we can do a little better job of trying to make sure that we're being more consistent in our processes. I'm glad to be here because I can learn some good ideas from colleagues.
If you, just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. So how are salaries accounted for, given the variation among faculty salaries? So Mary, maybe you'd like to start?
We do our salary projections based on, line by line, actual every faculty member that is employed at the university, to determine whether there's a need for maybe specific compensation plan for a unique area. We really lean heavily on benchmark information to make sure that we're competitive with our peer institutions and how much each one of the faculty members are being paid. Yeah, I'm going to go back to the first question on forecasting. Moorhead does everything that everybody just talked about. But the one other partner I think that is key in our process is our IR department, institutional research, and helping to determine retention and projected enrollment for future years. As Chris talked about the 5-year forecast, I think that the whole forecasting process, now I look back to in 2020 with COVID, being able to know that all of us were going to have, or most of us, I should say, or we're going to have pressured tuition enrollment because, it really takes 4 years to recover from decline in your new cohorts each year. So, that forecasting process has really been, the multi-year forecasting process has really been critical, I think, for all of us in the last few years.
Chris or Angie or Todd, do you all account for salaries differently than maybe what Mary described?
Well, at UK, the colleges do a lot of benchmarking with regard to UPD salary adjustments for anything. If you're asking about the regular salary process that we do each year, UK is a merit-based salary distribution primarily. Occasionally, if we cannot really fund a significant salary pool, we'll do across the board. And so then, of course, it's just across the board percentage based upon faculty and staff based. But we do try to also budget what we call a faculty retention fund to help keep faculty at the University of Kentucky if they're being recruited. It's someone with a large research portfolio and we really want them to stay. We seem like we're always having to fight efforts of other universities to take our faculty.
Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
No, we do things very similar to as everybody else described. I mean, in terms of if you're talking about from a budget perspective, we know who our faculty are. We know them by line item, and that's how we budget them for the current year and any upcoming years. Obviously, in terms of attempting to anticipate faculty salaries, we have expectations, but like every institution, we're always having to react somewhat to the market. And so we generally use departures, or we move, or we're adjusting between departments or between temporary faculty if we have to find additional funding in order to attract permanent faculty in a position that we really need, particularly for an accredited position. So, but from a pure budget perspective, it's like it was described earlier, where we know that by line item.
We've got a question in the chat. Adam, this one will be for you. When during the budgeting process do institutions receive confirmation about what their state appropriations will be?
Yeah, so confirmation, so we essentially submit this request, like I said, October 1 is where it goes out in the wild and then it's discussed and refined down. But really, the bulk of this will be during session. So session spans January, April, something like that, April, May. It'll typically be, it will be in the session and you'll get pretty much a pretty solid picture. And they still may make revisions in the next session, for the next fiscal year, or something like that. So, you know, it's very much a living process, but in terms of like a pretty concrete, it would be late in the spring, financial session.
And so this is another forecasting question. So how does the institutional, this is hard. How does the institutional expectation for state appropriations factor into your models when you're forecasting so many years out, 5 years out? Maybe Todd, you want to start?
Sure, and I would say I'll draw on some of my experience too previously being here. You know, I think we all know that as we start to budget that, state appropriation is a very fluid thing. And we recognize that it can be depending on what's happening. And the COVID years were years where we had to make some adjustments as we went. So we try to build in that forecasting and think about how things are going to be 5 years down the road. We also build in some contingency plans and some adjustments. Based on that, we build spreadsheets that if we start to see this thing happen, here's how we have to make this up, or here's the process that we're going to have to implement to try to adjust that. Those things can come up in any number of ways. I know during COVID, I was working at the Idaho State Board of Education, and very similar to our friends at UK, we had the Boise State football team, and that football revenue had a tremendous impact on that particular institution. You know, they still had employees to retain while they were playing in front of empty stadiums. And so it was, or how do we help, how do we adjust the budget accordingly to try to make sure that they continue to get the support they need. It's a very delicate process, and it feels like there's a lot of levers moving constantly to try to manage.
And I'll add this too, and then I'll ask for you all's, the rest of y'all's input, but a good corollary question is if state appropriations fall short of expectations, what revisions do you generally make first? So maybe Todd, you can answer that part.
Well, you know, I think one of the difficulties is that's where we start taking a look at employee salaries and our personnel. It's not the place we want to go, but as was pointed out earlier, it's the largest segment of our budget. So we try to build in a plan for a 3% salary adjustment every year as an overall goal. If something like that happens, if appropriations come, then it's okay, to what degree can we lower that, still possibly give something and retain our employees? That's usually a big piece. Very often I found some of the changes we have to make are around travel and professional development. That's often something that we put on pause for a year. We just try to figure out ways that we can best manage that and pull things back without impacting somebody's livelihood. I've never been through something where we've had to make a really deep cut where there were significant layoffs. We had to do some in the past. But you know, that would be reduction in force. It's not always where we want to go, but there are times where that becomes necessary. Thankfully, we've been able to manage and adjust where we've not had to do that. Right.
So then, Mary, how did the institution plan ahead for state appropriations, and then what do you look at if things come up for it?
So, you know, Mormon State University actually, through the performance funding model process, has lost significant state appropriations over the years since the model was implemented. And so I think a lot of the response, or as a result of that, we have leaned very heavily on some of that curriculum mapping, programming that I talked about in my presentation. You know, really looking at, as Casey discussed, looking at what are the true program needs and what are, you know, what's the credit hour generation for a department or for a college to determine, is there ways that they could offer their courses more efficiently? And, you know, luckily we we were able to make some tweaks to be able to increase faculty credit hour production. And then on the staff side, you know, really you have to have you have to have just scenarios built to contingent, you know, and as an example, when Adam showed the request, we have requested from the state a 4.5% increase for inflation for next year, and then another 4.5% for the year after. So in our budget process, we will begin to model what does it look like if that happens, and what does it look like if it doesn't, and have contingency plans in place so that when sign and die happens on April 15th, I think this year. So April 15th is the absolute date we will know for sure what our budget is for July 1. And so, you know, we'll build that out because it's a long process, as we already discussed, and change does not happen very quickly typically. So it's, you know, just all in planning and that forecast.
Can you explain what sign and die is?
That is the last day that the budget or the bill can be submitted and there not be any changes to it from that point forward, right?
Well, it's signing guys begins the meeting of the House. That's last day.
So if a bill hasn't been passed or an amendment of it by that date, it's not gonna happen. So whatever is proposed as of that date is what's gonna be signed, absent any veto of the
Chris, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, you know, I'd say, yeah, anything you're forecasting out more than a couple years, even more than a year, there can be a lot of variability to it. One of the approaches we take relative to state appropriations is state appropriations. They're appropriated on a biennium basis, so we have a pretty good idea in that second year of the biennium what the appropriation number is going to be, at least the base appropriation. And then we are estimating any changes to the performance funding. Because that number comes in late, whether it's in the late April in the budget cycle relative to being approved by the state, or if it's just a performance funding portion of it and CPE's calculation, which also tends to come in the spring. What we do is we try to be very conservative and set low expectations, kind of worst case scenarios around that, because that's going to be late in the budget cycle no matter what. And we don't want to have a negative surprise. As we look out further into, as we look out into that second, third, fourth, fifth years, what we try to do is, obviously we're looking at trends within the state. We're talking to our legislators where they think where the state will be in the next several bienniums. Talking with CPE, listening to CPE in terms of where they think the state will be in future bienniums. But we tend to be very conservative, and again, we don't forecast large, if any, increases in state appropriations in those outer years, and oftentimes are planning for even decreases in those outer years just to be safe, so we can begin to anticipate possible budget shortfalls, get ahead of those budget shortfalls, and then if state appropriations do come in better than expected, it's easier to add budget than it is to, and less painful than it is to take it away.
One question we got, Adam, maybe we can start with you. And then the other panels will answer from a slightly different perspective. So what general restrictions on budget are true for institutions across the board? And then I'll ask those from the institutions things about can you use one-time funds for ongoing expenses? Can we use it to jumpstart a project? So from the institutional perspective, what are the restrictions? But Adam, what are the overall restrictions that the CPE has?
Well, I mean, from like a post-secondary budget perspective, I think Mary went over the difference between the restricted and unrestricted funds. And that's broadly what I would kind of talk about, at least from our perspective. For example, whenever we talk about funds to educate students, right? So we essentially look at
what the appropriation is, but that appropriation includes restricted money. So that includes things like, what's it called, the GAD program, mandatory program essentially is statutory required. It includes debt service that has to be backed out. And that will get you essentially to an adjusted net general fund, which is unrestricted money plus your performance funding money, which is unrestricted. And so that would be essentially the funds that get students as my boss Billy. So so, you know, there's that from a higher level. We're talking about state appropriation, but also private gifts. They can be restricted or unrestricted more often than not. They are restricted. So, I mean, from that angle, and from the appropriation perspective, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at what funds are already operating and what they're obligated to, and then whittling that down to what can actually be used.
Maybe time, talk about those expenses.
Sure, and you know, I would particularly want to talk about the one-time expense versus ongoing. You know, I think from our perspective, one of the things I've often heard is, well, if you have money set aside, you have additional money in savings account, using the wrong way, why can't we then use it to help fund certain new projects or initiatives? As long as there's a sense of it's a one-year initiative or you've got funding to do it for a couple of years, that's fine. But to use your savings account, just like you use your home savings account, you don't use it for ongoing expenses, you use it for one-time expenses. And so we try to utilize what the fund balances we have to be able to invest into new facilities or new projects with the idea that it will generate revenue to maintain a program for the long term. And so I think that's a very helpful thing for people to understand when they're putting the budget together, because lots of people say, well, can't you just take some out of this category and fund it ongoing? And then it becomes a long-term obligation that you may not have the resources to do that. So it's really trying to be thoughtful about what those pieces are. But that's not something that CBE dictates to us. That's just wise business practice on our end.
I would agree. We look at the type of fund that is non-recurring or recurring. As the University of Kentucky, we have some recurring capital funds that are budgeted but not enough. So we really look to those savings fund balance to help pay for a lot of our non-recurring capital needs, you know, fun things, roof replacements, and window replacements, and infrastructure with regard to utilities. Those are perfect examples for using one-time savings. And you can say, well, where do those one-time savings come from? Most universities, because of the way they're managed and it is decentralized, or the expense authority is given to, for example, a dean of a college, most universities budget all positions that the college is authorized to have filled. But at any one point in time, all positions are not necessarily filled. So the savings or the vacancy savings come from when we've got a position that's budgeted but not filled, or a position that's budgeted with unrestricted funds, but that faculty member is on a grant. Part of their salary is being covered by a grant. Well, then that's going to give you some salary savings that if you do not have to hire like a PTI, those funds would, the next year, would be classified as fund balance. But again, unless you expect those funds to occur again, you can treat them as non-recurring one-time investments for the institution.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody has said, and I think it's one of the key things that if I had my dream is for everybody on the screen to be able to help to articulate to your campuses, because I know I hear all the time, you know, you've got you know, the university has X number of dollars in, you know, savings. Why aren't we getting raises? You can't give raises with money that's not gonna be there year after year. So you could, but if you did, you're gonna be cutting staff to be able to balance your budget in the future. And none of us want that.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
No, I think everybody covered that pretty well.
All right. So how participatory is the budget process at your all's institutions? Are there negotiations with individual units about final budgets? Chris, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, our budget office works with each unit and provides those units with the opportunity to submit budget requests, reallocate their budget, reallocate their draft budget or their proposals for what they spent last year if they want to spend it in different ways. Ultimately, those roll up to the divisional heads. So whether that's the provost or head of advancement, et cetera, et cetera. And then at cabinet, we make those final decisions. But we involve the departments very early. We put out that draft budget. We put out our longer term pro forma early in the process. We're already putting those out now here in October for budget cycle for 2027. And we give the opportunity for a lot of input. Unfortunately, some of the timing, we were unable to make some final decisions, again, because of the timing primarily relative to the state, but also in some respects relative to enrollment. So, I know what my fall enrollment is. I don't yet know what my spring enrollment is. Last year, we didn't know what our performance funding number was until the spring. This year, we won't know what the state funding what the state's approval is, or at least what's up for approval until the spring as well. So, we begin to work with different scenarios and we attempt to bake in as many of those, and then we prioritize those requests at the cabinet level. So that way, once we know what our final numbers are, once we've got that state funding, once we've got that spring enrollment, we can begin to make as many final decisions as possible leading up to the budget we put in front of the board.
I would say ours is very similar. I'm trying to think of anything to add.
Anyone else have anything to add? All right, we've got a question in the chat. What types of roles are reporting to you all as CFO or VP for finance? What roles report to you, and what are your essential reporting lines? And I would assume everybody's essential if you got them in your crew, but so tell us a little bit about who reports to you in your offices. Mary, you want to start?
So I have information technology. I have auxiliary services, so things like our document center, bookstore, and then the traditional accounting and finance type functions. So I have budget office, student accounting, general accounting, I'm trying to think, purchasing. I think that's it.
That's it.
Yeah, so I'm going through my head, so I'm my word chart, but yeah. So, and as far as essential personnel, almost everybody I just listed would be considered essential because it, depending on the nature of what's happening, because we always want to make sure that students get served and that the IT systems are up and working
Angie?
As the chief budget officer at the university, my role is more limited than Mary. I've got the budget staff that reports to me, and then I'm also responsible for capital planning at UK, and then we also assist with the federal and state legislative review.
I have several areas. I have financial services reports to me, and because we do a lot of shared service things, that's the centralized budget function for the system. And that also includes student accounts. So we manage the student account piece of things through financial services. business services, including the consolidated, shared services of procurement, and accounts payable, for the KCTCS systems. They report to me. We have a group called Facility Support Services and Capital Procurement Services to deal with our facilities. We don't work directly with DECA anymore. We've pulled that, and so we're managing all of our capital projects internally. That includes things like insurance, leases, safety and security, environmental health and safety, OSHA requirements, all those things fall under facilities. I have treasury services, which is all of our banking and accounting side of the house. And our investment side of the house works very closely with our advancement department. Financial aid reports to me, that's a relatively big thing for me. And then we also have technology solutions, which is our IT, and that actually runs the IT for our system as a whole. And recently added in the spring to me is the Kentucky Fire Commission as part of KCTCS, and that reports to me. And that is the one area I have to say I'm learning every day, because working with firefighters is a very different thing. And we had a system office event yesterday, and they cooked chili for us, and firefighter chili is great. So now I'm very happy with the fire commission.
Chris, what can you add?
So in addition to traditional financial services that report to the CFO, I also have information technology, human resources, facilities, our police department, and all of our auxiliaries. On the financial services side, we basically split our team up into, you've got your accounting team. We also have more of our treasury and student account services team, and then a budget office / financial planning and analysis team.
Got another question from the chat. Adam had mentioned the liquidity calculation that's mandated by the state, and having 3-month minimum. So are there any preferred ratios or metrics you're relying on when making budgeting and capital investment decisions or requests? And do you think about efficiency or solvency like you would in a corporate setting? Angie, let's start with you.
Yes, we definitely consider liquidity and solvency in all decisions. Capital financing, trying to use various fund sources is a complex decision. We use several financing metrics to measure. I'll tell you one that seems to resonate well with our board is to look at the percent of our operating revenues that are devoted to debt service. And it is a way to kind of measure how much debt, of course, that the institution has taken on. UK has grown substantially with its healthcare enterprise. And so as the revenue increases because of those healthcare enterprises, we're constantly looking at how much more debt can we take on in terms of debt service. That would be a first draw on that.
Mary? We do what Angie just discussed, but in addition to that, we rely heavily on the Moody's scorecard. So Moody's is the rating agency that will rate our bonds. So as if Northern or Moorhead or KCTCS is going to do a capital project that is what's termed agency bond supported, or the university issues the debt, then before we go to market, if you will, sell those bonds to investors to raise the money to build a residence hall or what have you, you go through a bond rating process. And in that bond rating process, both Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, who are the major companies that do ratings, they all have standard methodologies. And we lean most heavily on Moody's methodology, which has standard ratios that are used to determine the financial health. And the thing that we like about Moody's is annually they publish what the medians are for other institutions. So, you know, I can go and look at a small public, university that is the same, financial rating as us and see how much cash do they have, what are the pays cash, what are, you know, the various metrics, to compare ourselves with them. So,
We do many of those same things. We also use something called the Composite Financial Index.
Oh, yes.
with our taxes, which involves a series of 4 different ratios that help establish an institution's solvency or success. I will say it's really designed to watch trends more than it is a snapshot in time. So it helps determine, do you actually have funds that you can invest in one-term things without being detrimental to your institutions? So we take a look at that for all 16 of our colleges. We're actually in the process of creating a process whereby every year we take a look at the financial solvency, as well as some other pieces about how we're using our capital facilities and how well they're functioning. Where we can sort of be a scorecard each of our colleges so that they can help determine how well they're doing. Are there other things that they need to address? It's not at all meant to be punitive. It's meant to be, we're starting to watch a trend in one area and want to be able to step in and support and try to provide some help.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, one of the things I would say about a lot of the common financial ratios is that they're more valuable when you look at them over periods of time rather than single snapshots. And they're most valuable if you're looking at them across a number of different organizations. So like similar institutions. I came from Ohio, came from an Ohio institution, and the state of Ohio is very focused on financial ratios and keeping long-standing comparisons of those financial ratios, and really reinforcing that across all institutions within all state institutions. I haven't had the same experience here in Kentucky, and so we really haven't levered, and I haven't found very much traction amongst my board members and key stakeholders around trying to look at financial ratios. So we just haven't used them as much. I do look at a lot of, I've got a number of very key KPIs and that I look at and that have found much more traction with my board members in particular. And then a number that I look at just on a day-to-day, monthly basis, whatever, for my own purposes and more internal with my president and cabinet. But one thing I would say, one ratio that has gained some traction, it's not really a formal ratio, but one that we look at and have run this, going back in time, and we did find that it's really correlated very well to our particular institution's fiscal performance, and that is our net tuition revenue against our personnel expenses. And you could when I use that ratio and I look at what our net tuition revenue is, and I compare that to our personnel expenses, it's very easy to see that we didn't react very quickly when our net tuition revenue started going down, because we continued to increase personnel expenses and our fiscal performance deteriorated very quickly. So that's one ratio that I have found traction here at NKU, which in comparison to other more common financial ratios, just haven't been able to get much traction here.
All right. Thank you all. We're going to wrap it up with one question for each of you kind of quickly, because I don't think they'll take a whole lot of discussion. So I'll start with you, Adam. What are there institutions? Do you know if there are institutions in the state that use models such as zero-based budgeting, dynamic or rolling budgeting, or activity-based budgeting?
I'm not entirely sure on what everyone's using at the institution level. Yeah, we tend to look at from the state perspective some of the bigger picture items.
Okay.
So we lean on them in terms of methodology.
Okay. Well, then I'll ask the rest of you as well. Maybe Mary's pointing at Angie.
Okay. To the best of my knowledge, I don't believe that anybody is using zero-based budgeting on any kind of a permanent. I do think institutions have they can routinely pick one like, okay, we're going to do zero-based budgeting on this unit, and really trying to think about what's going on and is it appropriate or not. Activity-based, we get to RCM, based, there are some institutions, I believe, Chris, your institution is RCM. The University of Kentucky is incremental mostly, but then we have some performance-based items in there.
Let's see, Chris, question for you. Can, as a health, so if I were a healthcare certified faculty member who pays money for registration and licensure, et cetera, is there a way for me to request that professional development be included in my salary, so it's pre-tax?
Yeah, you could work through your dean and work through your department, through the dean, and we can look at whether that's something we would be able to build into the budget as part of our budget for the future, if it's something that we don't budget for currently. So that would be part of that budget request cycle that we offer every year to every department.
Mary, I understand the emphasis on technology, but why are the liberal arts and social sciences unable to receive Perkins money? I'm sorry, I meant Todd.
Community college.
Well, yeah, so we do receive Perkins money, and it's specifically for those kinds of technology and other pieces. That's what the Perkins money is designed specifically to do. So, but of course, as we function, we don't have liberal arts and social sciences as a sector within most of our business. Yes, it's totally like what we would call general ed. But that is part of the Perkins purpose.
Mary, now I scribbled out names and whatnot. One thing I find particularly concerning is our budget for professional development. It's an essential part of our annual evaluation, but it's so small at my college and hasn't changed in nearly a decade. Is that typical?
I believe that would be dependent on the financial pressures for the individual university as a whole, and the budget process the university is using, and what's the strategic initiatives that are pressuring, if you will, the resource allocation for the professional development. If that's something that you're seeing in your individual institution, I would encourage you to take it to the chair, your college dean, and start to have those conversations to make sure that it is built into that budget request process. All of us have a mechanism for requesting new funds. And so we just need to make sure that gets on the radar if that's something that you're experiencing.
Would that be one of the things, one of the previous questions had to do what happens when it's kind of a crunch time with the budget? Is it possible that professional development funding would be something that would be cut before salaries?
I do think, yes. I think that if there is a, you know, as was discussed earlier by my colleagues, they typically, if there's a unexpected decline in revenue late in the budget process, you'll look to those kind of low-hanging fruit, the travel, professional development, things like that, that you can easily react to, that will kind of bide you time, if you will, to develop a way to reduce costs long term. You know,
I've got one more and I shuffled around, so I don't remember which one of you I didn't ask a question of. So I'll just raise your hand if it wasn't you, or I'll sign it. So if you have, if a faculty member comes to you with a budget question, what do they need to bring with them to have the conversation with you at a meaningful way? So maybe we'll just open to everyone. So if someone has a question for you about the budget, or they want to spend money on something, what do they need to be able to bring to you so that you can have an informed conversation?
I mean, I think that the key thing is how it relates to the university strategic plan, and being able to tie it back to one of the specific goals of the university, and then, you know, how that trickles down to what they're specifically requesting.
Chris, do you mind responding to that too?
Yeah, you know what I would say is a couple things. One, I would expect I expect if somebody's coming to me with a budget request that they would have been paying attention to, or at least gone back to look at our board presentations in particular around the budget situation. So have kind of some familiarity around, you know, what our budget priorities are and what our budget situation is and our current fiscal situation is. As it relates to the specific budget request, I would expect them to have spoken with their chain of command as well. So, you know, have support from their department, have support from their dean. If it's something that's going to drive enrollment, that's going to be important because that's going to generate revenue to cover the expense. If it's not, need to understand then why else is it a priority? Typically, you know, the next biggest priority would be if it's something related to accreditation. If it's an additional expense that wasn't budgeted and it's not going to generate revenue, then my next question is going to be, is there an opportunity for us to cut expenses somewhere else in order to make that up? Or is there somewhere else within that department or within that college where we can find some savings or make an adjustment there? And then if not, then, you know, like I said, it really does go back to making sure that that's something that's supported by leadership. And then depending on the size of the request is going to determine whether that's something we can make a decision on right then and there, or something we'd have to make a decision with a provost level or a dean level or a cabinet level.
I think I would go with what Chris said, first and foremost, to follow the chain of command to make sure you get to the right person. And I get a lot of questions that, and it's not necessarily faculty, but it's department chairs usually, that they want to do something and they've already figured out how they think it needs to be done. So to come with an open mind and really have a discussion about what it is that you want to occur and not necessarily how it occurs, because unfortunately as a public institution, there are a lot of regulations that we have to follow. We are quasi-state agencies. We have to follow the model procurement code. There's a whole list of things. So I'd like it to be more of a dialogue and what are you trying to achieve? Now let's figure out the best way.
I really agree with that. And I think some of it depends on if you're coming to the budget office with, how do I build the budget around this? As opposed to, I've got a budget for this, are you ready to approve it? Because you're coming for counsel and advice. I think every business officer I know is very happy to sit down and have a conversation. I think the big question is really the why question. Why are you asking for this to be funded? Is it to help the institution? It might be just to help your department or your area. And it's not that we don't want to do that, but I think within the big budget context, that's what it is. Is how does this help advance the strategic plans we've already talked about and the priorities of the organization? I'd also say often people will come in and they'll say, well, here's what I've estimated the salary to be. We work very closely with HR to determine what the job would be, what that salary is. But there are costs that are connected to that salary that very often aren't seen. So when it comes to insurance, benefits, all those other pieces, the institution side of taxation, our rate on top of that is 43% where we are. So it just to make that simple, if you're hiring $100,000 position, that actually comes out to $143,000 a year in actual cost for the institution. So I think we're all willing to help and understand, help you understand the request. But those are the kinds of things that will help. The other thing I would say to you is we don't have a magic money closet. I used to joke with faculty about that. I wish I did. If I did, people tell me that they think of me like Scrooge McDuck rolling around in the coins in the vault. So we actually do that, as has been mentioned, have to find a way to help support that through cutting something else, thinking on, is it revenue and things. We're happy to have those conversations with you, but just feel free to come in and try to say, we want to see the comprehensive perspective to help you succeed.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're at time. Chris, thank you very much. Mary, Angie, Todd, and Adam, thank you all for being here. Faculty Leadership Academy participants, I'll send you an email here shortly with your post-session work and the presentations from today. They'll also be in the Teams channel. If you need something from me, don't hesitate to ask. I hope you all have a great weekend. Bye-bye.